Hello, everyone. Welcome to week 9. This week we are talking evaluation process, design, and implementation. Before we get into lecture content for this week, there's a bunch of housekeeping stuff to discuss, so I'm going to run through that kind of as quickly as possible. We'll talk about the final exam, we'll talk about assignment 2, we'll talk about some marks coming out, and then we'll get into the course content. So I'm going to jump right into the final exam information because I know a few of you have reached out regarding that. So the final exam, it will run in the same way that the midterm ran. The difference between the midterm and the final exam is that instead of having just that 1 week, you have the entire exam period to complete the exam. You do only get one shot, okay? So keep that in mind. You have one attempt. You can do it at any time during the exam period. That being said, the same sort of rules apply. Make sure that you have a strong connection, you're in a quiet area, so on and so forth. Technically, the exam is open book. That being said, I still use the lockdown browser, okay? So, best to have your notes nearby. That's all I'm going to say. Alongside that, please do it independently. Again, another given. Final exam content will be cumulative, and that's pretty much it. It's going to be the same sort of thing. It's approximately 10 questions per week of content, and it covers all the content, okay? The focus is on the lecture content, less so on anything that would be found in the textbook. So if you study the lecture content, you should be fine. If you have any questions about that, once again, please let me know well ahead of time. It will open the first day of exam week, and then it will end the last day of the exam week. So it will correspond within it. With the final exam, I do leave it open until 11:59 p.m. for this round. Okay, so next up is assignment 2. As I've said previously, I like to use assignments that mirror what you would see in kind of the professional domain. So for this one, what we're doing is we're building a key performance indicator dashboard. So I've created 2 sample data sets. The idea will be that you will pick one out of the 2 data sets. I believe one is from a long-term care setting. The other one is from an ER room setting, okay? There are similarities between the 2, but there are differences corresponding to each environment. It doesn't matter which one you pick. Whichever one you feel like you want to play with, go for it. That being said, when you pick your data set and you start working on it, take a look at the data itself, see if the data is usable. If it's not, do what you need to do to make it usable. So that includes cleaning the data, looking for any entries that are erroneous. So for example, I'll give you an example from some of my previous work. When asking a population about how many minutes they spent on physical activity, we were getting values that were inputted that there were more minutes than there were in the day that these people were saying they were performing in 24 hours. When that happens, you assume that that's a mistake because no one can physically do more than 24 hours of physical activity in a day. And even then, that's highly unlikely. So you have to deal with those values appropriately. Once you've done that, you can make additional variables based on the variables within your data set. Again, another example of this, if I give you, for example, weight and height, you can come up with BMI and use that as an indicator if you like. There's a lot of freedom with this assignment in terms of what you display. The idea is that you're picking appropriate indicators that you think should be displayed to stakeholders, okay? So for the dashboard itself, there's a couple different softwares that you can use. I'm not picky which software you use. So you can use RStudio, you can use Power BI, you can use Microsoft Excel. I do give a 5% bonus if you use RStudio or Power BI. The reason for that is that these are kind of the softwares of choice right now in the professional domain. I want to give a little bit more incentive for you to practice with that software, okay? On top of that, so you want to make visuals. You don't want to include just kind of tables. right? You want to make it so that the stakeholder who might not have any background knowledge of what you're trying to display, they can look at it and take in that information easily. All right. There's a bunch of examples online of how you should build up your dashboard. Visuals should also be well labeled. I shouldn't have to guess when I look at any of the graphs or visuals that you have there what it represents, okay? And make sure that it's labeled appropriately. This might involve changing variable names or labels within the data set itself, depending on what program you use. With this assignment, I will be very clear, it is better to start this one early because of building out that dashboard. Sometimes you have this great idea, you go to do it, and there's a problem with the data set. You got to go back and work on the data set, okay? So really stressful when you start the assignment on the day that it's due. On top of the dashboard, you have to provide a one-page summary of the justification of why you chose the indicators that you did. Now, this is probably going beyond what you would do in the professional domain, but that's because in the professional domain, you would be able to have a conversation about it. I want to know why you picked the indicators that you did, all right? It doesn't have to be a formal one-pager. Your justification can be brief, it can be point form, but it should be clear and concise as to why you picked the indicator that you did, okay? The due date for this assignment is April 3rd, 2026 at 7:59 p.m. So this one, unlike the final exam, this one is 7:59. If you have questions about this assignment, please send them early so that we can meet and discuss. I will post a tutorial on how to use RStudio ahead of time so that you have that resource, but there are a bunch of other resources, like I said. If you can just Google RStudio or Power BI tutorials, a bunch will come up, and there are a bunch of good ones. While we're on the topic of assignments, assignment 1 marks, I'm going to release next week. I'm going to do it as early as I can. I've got a few left to mark, and then those marks will be released. Midterm marks, if they're not released already, I will release them. I will have a look now that I'm thinking about it. So any questions with any of that stuff? With the marks, the 24-hour policy rule does apply. When the marks are released, I will not be answering messages for 24 hours. You're not supposed to send messages for 24 hours, but after that 24-hour period has elapsed, I will begin answering any of the messages that were sent after that 24-hour period. Yeah, so other than that, let's get on to course content for this week.
Okay, so before we dive into the evaluation specific material, we are going to talk about program, service, or procedure planning, okay? So the number one principle with evaluation is knowing the program, procedure, or service, right? I'm pretty sure we've brought this up before in other avenues, especially like the customer service avenue. The most important thing is understanding what it is you're evaluating, okay? So for this reason, we're gonna go through the steps of program planning, just so that you're familiar with it, not necessarily so that you can design your own program, but just understanding it so that when we move on to the evaluation context, nothing gets lost in translation, okay? And what you should note, and I'll point it out as we go through the steps, evaluation is going to be used in this process of planning, okay? So step 1, right away, what you're going to do is you're going to conduct a needs assessment by engaging the stakeholders and the implementers and asking them what they want, all right, and what they need. So what this is going to do is this is going to build the foundation for step 2, which is where you're going to describe in detail the aims and the goals of the program. Okay, so this is basically saying, okay, what am I circling or centering my energy for development of this program around, and really going to tackle these problems. Step 3 is where you're going to develop the draft of the proposal of your action plan. So describing in detail what you're going to do, how you're going to do it, what you need to implement the program, the procedure, or the service, so on and so forth, okay? Now, step 4, this is where you're going to conduct kind of your first mini evaluation, okay? What you're going to do is you're going to take that proposal, of your initial action plan, and you're going to give it to the stakeholders and the implementers, and you're going to seek feedback. Okay, is this plan going to accomplish what we're hoping it to accomplish, or is this action plan reasonable and feasible in your opinion? You're going to collect feedback from them, and in step 5, what you're going to do is you're going to refine that action plan based on this feedback. Okay. Sometimes what you might do is you might develop an entire action plan, give it to the stakeholders, and they may say that's not going to work, and then they'll give you a list of reasons. Now it's your job to go back, take that information, and improve the quality of the plan so that you make it feasible. Okay, so that's your first kind of introduction into the evaluation process right there. Now, in step 6 is important because you can get stuck in this kind of perpetual loop of developing a plan, seeking feedback, refining the plan, and then sending it back for further feedback. And it can get into this continuous loop where you're always refining the plan, trying to make it perfect. I suggest maybe sending it back for feedback 1 or 2 times, and then going straight into implementing the plan. All right, 1 or 2 times should be more than enough for stakeholders to give you the adequate amount of feedback to get you a working plan. Okay, so once you've done that, you go to step 6, where you're going to implement that plan or that model or the design. And then in step 7, what you're going to do is you're going to evaluate again, but this time you're going to evaluate, in essence, the pilot program or procedure, and you're going to get tangible measurements. Okay. At this point, you're going to evaluate for successes and shortcomings, because being most likely a novel program or procedure, there's going to be shortcomings. And you're going to compile this evidence and the outcomes, and you're going to build a nice little report from it. In step 8, you're going to disseminate that information to the stakeholders and the implementers, once again asking for feedback. How can we improve it? Okay, so there's kind of another piece of where the evaluation is going to come in handy. And then at this point, decisions may be made whether the program continues, whether it stops, or whether to implement improvements and try again. When this happens, you're going to go back to step 5 and refine the plan, and then repeat steps 5 to 8 over and over again until you're happy with the product that you produce. Okay, so while it appears to be very linear, this program planning, there are kind of circular elements. Like I said, you're going to have a bit of a circular element from steps 3 to 5, and then another one from 5 to 8. Okay, so SMART goals. I'm sure you've all heard of SMART goals before, but this is just to mention them, just to refresh your memory very quickly. When we talk about evaluations and determining and developing goals, we want them to be SMART goals. So we want them to be specific. We want them to state exactly what it is that you want to accomplish, using who, what, where, and why. You want them to be measurable. Okay, so especially important with evaluation, we need tangible variables that we can look at and rank our success or our shortcomings. We want them to be achievable as well. So we don't want to set them up too far out of reach to set us up for failure beforehand. We want them to be realistic. We want the goals also to be relevant. So we do want them to be challenging and results based, and they have to be properly resourced. And lastly, they have to be time bound. You need to have deadlines in which to achieve certain goals. Otherwise, it's very easy to just push a goal further down the timeline and never actually achieve anything. Okay, so really the main message here is to, whenever realistically you're setting goals or objectives, whether it's program planning or throughout evaluation, you always want them centered around SMART goals. Okay, so what is evaluation? Evaluation is the determination of value, nature, or quality of something. Okay, now when we're talking about value, we're talking about something having merit. Okay, it has almost an inherent worth to it. Okay, now value is going to change depending on the context in which we're talking about it. Right, so in certain circumstances, something that initially has value might not in a different context. Right, so in something like a production line, I might value the strength of a product, the durability of a product, whereas in another kind of context, I might look at something and want to design it so that it's fragile. Okay, so both these things, both these properties have value in different contexts, different environments. All right, now program evaluation at its core, it's an evaluation used to determine the merit or worth of a specific program. And like I said, that merit or worth will be defined by that program's goals and objectives. Now, essentially, the purpose of evaluation is the systematic examination of a program. We're going to look at this program, we're going to tear it apart, we're going to see if it's operating like it should and producing the results that it should. We are going to utilize the scientific method, so that's going to bring crossover from kind of our research methods world into the realm of quality improvement, okay, and performance management. We are going to examine the operation of a program. How is that program implemented, and is it doing what it's designed to do? Okay, so the operations piece is important for interpretation and improvement. We need to know how something is operating, how that program is implemented, so that we can identify shortcomings, we can identify things where they're not being implemented as planned, so that we can correct it and we can improve efficiency or quality of the outcome. Now, in our examination of this effectiveness or the outcomes of a program, what we need to do is typically we're going to use the evidence generated through the evaluation and compare it to a set of standards that have already been determined a priori or before the evaluation to see if we are meeting the goals and the objectives. Okay. So the improvement of programs and policies, if you think back to the program planning slide, it's done in a circular fashion. Okay, so we're going to be continuously evaluating and continuously improving all along the process with a few exceptions, but these exceptions typically rest in what's called like a summative evaluation, where we're trying to determine if it's worth continuing a program, right? If we stop the program, there's no need for further evaluation. So that's probably the only time we don't need continuous evaluation. Now, principally, evaluation fosters quality, right? So the nature of evaluation in its own is to improve a program. It's going to yield information that has the potential to improve the programs if we utilize it correctly. Now, this information, it has to provide the necessary information, okay? So that's where we have to really properly identify the variables that we're evaluating, make sure that they align with the objectives and the goals, okay? And we do this for quality improvement and maximum effectiveness, right? This should be outlined in the goals and objectives of the program, but if not, we need to be able to understand the program well enough that we can develop them our own. Now, just like we need good information, that good information will always lead to better decisions. The quality of the information that we gather is directly related to the quality of the decisions we make on the improvement of the program, okay? And lastly, as mentioned on the last slide, it is a continuous improvement process. We don't ever just do one evaluation and we're done, unless it's in kind of that pilot program phase and the program has failed and we're discontinuing it, right? But as long as a program is running, it requires continuous evaluation and continuous improvement. So at its highest level, we really have two types of evaluation. We have formative evaluation and we have summative evaluation. Formative evaluation is going to provide information to the program staff for program improvement while that program is still operational. So this is typically what we think of when we think of the continuous improvement model and continuous evaluation. It's done through formative evaluations. This includes things such as process evaluations, needs assessments, and implementation assessments. On the other hand, we have summative evaluations, which provide information on effectiveness, and this is going to lead to the decision of whether to continue with the program or discontinue it. Are we getting what we need out of the program, or at least getting enough out of the program that it warrants continuing to put the program on? Or is the program running at a deficit or not producing any results in such a fashion that we're better off discontinuing the program and going with something else? These type of evaluations include outcome evaluations, impact evaluations, cost-benefit analysis, and meta-analyses. Now remember, formative decisions, basically the decisions made from a formative evaluation, they form, they shape, and they improve the program while it's being implemented. Okay, so it is that continuous improvement. And as it was mentioned on the previous slide, we have a few different ways that we can perform formative evaluation. The first is process evaluation. So this is really looking at the phase of the program being evaluated. All right, so we're looking at individual processes and we're going to evaluate that specific phase of the program. We then have implementation assessments, and what this does is we're trying to understand if the program is being implemented as planned, and if not, why is it not being implemented as planned, and bringing it back to the original plan that was designed. The other kind of formative evaluation, a needs assessment. So this is a systematic examination of what services are needed by whom and in what way they are needed. So what this is doing is we're going to compare that needs assessment to the outcomes of the program, and theoretically what we want to see is that these two things will match up, right? Because we want to be producing what the needs assessment says the customers or the stakeholders need, okay? The last one, an evaluability assessment, basically looks at the program and asks, is it feasible to do an evaluation of a particular program? So sometimes it might not even be worth doing the evaluation itself, and this could happen for multiple reasons. The most common is the program has not been implemented long enough to actually produce any sort of tangible outcome that we can measure and compare to a set of standards, right? If I roll out a program, let's say I'm looking at the effectiveness of distribution of a certain medication. Let's say there's a novel way to distribute medication. If I do an assessment after 1 week of implementing this new process, it might not be long enough to really see the effects of this program. I might have to wait 6 months to see, okay, does this work, right? Especially with novel programs and something like medication distribution, everyone is really excited for kind of this new methodology, and everyone's going to jump to it and want to partake. Over time, I want to see if that holds up. On the flip side, you might implement a program that is really slow at the start for uptake or participation. So you want to let a little bit of time elapse in that case to see if that participation increases naturally, so that you really generate enough data to form that kind of analysis piece that you can set to compare against standards. Now with summative decisions, right, the decisions based off summative evaluation, the primary goal, the primary purpose of these evaluations, we are deciding the outcome of a program. Does it continue or does it discontinue? Okay, we do this through a couple different ways. The first is an outcome evaluation. So realistically, we're looking at the long-term goals of the program, and we're trying to determine if these goals have been met. If they've been met, we might say there's no longer need for this program, we might shut it down, or there might be a continuous need for the program because it's meeting the goals, and we'll continue it. It depends on what those long-term goals are. On the flip side, we might see, okay, the program is nowhere near the long-term goals, and if it's a detrimental kind of impact, we're going to discontinue that program. We're also going to look at an impact evaluation. So this measures all of the impacts of a program, both intended and unintended. And we're going to circle back to unintended consequences of a program later on in this lecture, but just be aware that there are both intended and unintended consequences whenever you implement a program, all right? We then have cost-benefit analyses. So cost-benefit analyses, what we're doing is we're looking at the cost of a program versus the dollars saved from the implementation, right? We always want the benefit to outweigh the cost, right? Then we have the cost effectiveness. So the total cost of the program compared to the program impact, right? What are we getting for the money that's being spent? Are we getting our money's worth? And then at the end, we have meta-analyses and meta-evaluations. This in turn brings us to embedding evaluation within a program. An embedded evaluation is basically a method of continuous improvement of programs through consistent evaluation. So if you think of the two types, this would fall into the formative evaluation side of things. Okay. What this does is we are embedding evaluation into the design, development, and implementation of programs and projects. Okay, so we're making it part of our action plan that we will evaluate at certain time periods, and it will always go on and occur. In that way, we're generating like a continuous loop of data in which we can rely on to make decisions based on quality improvement of that program. Now, embedded evaluation isn't a unique process. It does combine elements from common evaluation approaches, so everything we just previously talked about. Now, we also have theory-based evaluation. Basically what this is it's looking at specific indicators and if they align with underlying theory of the program which is being evaluated. So a good program, when it's developed, it will be developed based on a theory, right? Basically, think of it as being developed on best practice guidelines, right? Or best evidence available. It's evidence informed. We want to, when we're doing our evaluations, a theory-based evaluation, we'll pick indicators that align with the underlying theory, all right? So if I'm looking at some sort of medical care, right? So let's take it back to kind of the falls behaviors. The indicators I'm going to use to evaluate my falls prevention program is probably going to be something that's in line with the theory on why people fall at high rates, right? We know that, as I've discussed in previous lectures, obviously I'm going to look at the indicator of number of falls, but we also know, based on theory, that use of antipsychotic medication can influence the number of falls of a resident in long-term care. So I'm probably going to want to include that indicator in my theory-based evaluation. Now, it's been said before, but we'll say it again. The embedded evaluations are cyclical, okay? So we want, anytime you see continuous, right, continuous quality improvement, we're looking at something that's cyclical. It continually happens. We also need to understand that embedded evaluation is going to go beyond program monitoring, right? Program monitoring is simply just looking at the program to see what it's doing. What we are looking to do is we're building off of that monitoring piece, and we're trying to directly improve the program by implementing certain changes while that program is still running. As with any other evaluation, the first step to embedding evaluation into a program is to understand the program and understand what you want to evaluate within it. If you don't understand the program, you can't understand what it is that you want to evaluate. Once you have a full understanding of the program, then you can move on to developing indicators and really starting to plan your evaluation, okay? But without that knowledge, you won't be able to develop any sort of questions or define those metrics or the indicators of that evaluation, okay? In terms of embedding that evaluation, so the framework for evaluation is going to be grounded in continuous improvement theory, okay? And this framework is based on 5 steps. What we're going to do is we're going to define our parameters. We're going to plan surrounding those parameters. We're going to come up with our evaluation plan. We're going to implement that plan. That plan is going to generate findings, which we are going to interpret. We are going to take the interpretation of those findings. We're going to tie them up in a nice little report. We're going to inform the stakeholders and the program staff, anyone involved with either the program or the process. We're going to collect feedback from them, and then we're going to refine our plan and then continue in a circular manner. Okay, so now that we've kind of set the foundation of the evaluation, we understand what types of evaluation are out there, how to embed our evaluation into a program, we're going to talk about actually planning the evaluation. Now, when we start to develop our evaluation, what we want to do is we want to center it around the ideas of quality, practicality, and feasibility. Okay, so the questions we are asking our participants have to center around these principles. All right. What we want to do is develop evaluation questions that guide data collection efforts and the analysis of the data. Okay. Again, this is going to feed back into those quality, practicality, and feasibility dimensions of the questions. So now remember that evaluation is very similar to the scientific method or the research method, and whenever we're doing research, they're based around questions. We're either asking participants questions or we're conducting semi-structured interviews or focus groups, but it always centers around asking people questions to try and figure out the knowledge we're seeking. So with evaluation questions, we want to provide structure for focusing the evaluation through the questions that we're asking, right? The first step to this is always to understand the program. That is first and foremost with anything with evaluation that we have to do. The next is what we're going to do is we're going to actually look at the logic model with the program, because for those who are familiar with program development and planning, there should always be a logic model attached to any sort of program, procedure, or service. We want to look at that logic model and use that to assist us in generating the questions. That logic model should essentially have all the information that we need, so we should be able to use that to really focus our evaluation. Now, when we look at the evaluation questions we want to use, we need to evaluate them using 4 criteria. Okay, so the first one is stakeholder engagement. I need my question to directly engage the stakeholder, right? Does it make really a sense to them? Are they going to even want to answer it? This is what we really mean by that stakeholder engagement. Is it appropriate for that person? Which fits into our second criteria, appropriate fit. Is the question I'm asking appropriate for the outcomes I'm looking for? This then leads to the relevance piece. Is it relevant to what I'm looking for, right? Because if I'm trying to gauge kind of the understanding of the issues in surgical wait times, right? I'm probably not going to ask any sort of questions based on something like intake process, right? If I'm asking about the intake process of the day of the surgery, well, the wait time has already passed. It's not relevant to finding out why people are waiting so long from diagnosis to actually going to the surgical suite for their operation, right? We want to make sure the question we're asking is relevant to what we're trying to assess. The last one is feasibility. Okay, so feasibility, is it feasible that I'm asking this specific audience the question, right? If I'm working with a vulnerable population, I'm probably going to ask my semi-structured interview questions a little differently than I would with a population that's not considered vulnerable, right? I'm going to, maybe I use survey tools for specific samples, and for other samples and other program evaluation questions, I'm going to use open-ended methods like semi-structured interviews, right? This really speaks to the feasibility. Does this yield to people producing accurate and reliable answers? Now, I should say when we're talking about structuring evaluation questions and we're structuring kind of our data collection tools, it's always easier to use something that's already been implemented, that's already been shown to be valid and reliable. But there are cases where this won't be the case. You might be investigating novel questions that have never been approached before. In that case, if you're structuring evaluation questions, you want to avoid complex multi-part questions. You want to break it down to be as simple as possible. It's always better to have more questions rather than have a few questions that are very complex and questions that will essentially lose the participant along the way. If I ask you realistically like a 3-part question in one, chances are you're going to answer one part of that question, ignore the other 2 parts, and then I actually miss important information. It's better that I ask you 3 questions separately to get the information I need. Okay, and so with that being said, it often improves the question if you utilize sub-questions, right? It almost guides them through the answers or the thought process. That's going to yield more detailed information. It's going to help your analysis when you get there. All right, so when we talk about embedding evaluation questions, what we have to do is we have to prioritize specific questions, right? We want to make sure that we're including measurements, or I should say we're including questions that provide measurements in all three categories of the logic models, right? We want to look at things that are looking at short-term, intermediate objectives, the implementation of the program, and long-term goals. Oftentimes, it's very easy to get caught up in one of these three categories, and then by the end of it, you end up with an evaluation that's looking at, let's say, strictly long-term goals, right? We want to look at every step of the logic model to ensure that we don't miss any opportunity for quality improvement. We also want to focus on process informative questions for newer programs, while these same questions may be less useful for mature programs. Remember, novel programs probably yield a higher likelihood for continuous improvement. The idea being that mature programs have already undergone a few of these cycles of quality improvement. So you're running into the end of the line of things that you can improve upon, and now you're looking at kind of the minute details in which you can improve upon. The more mature the program, the more you might be running into kind of summative questions, whether to continue or discontinue the program, whereas that new program still has a lot of room to grow. You'll remember earlier I said that we have to evaluate both intended and unintended consequences of the program. Okay, so sometimes what happens is when we roll out a program, there are unintended consequences. These can either be good or bad. They're simply consequences that we did not plan for or we did not foresee happening. Right? Now, it's very easy to miss these unintended consequences because we're not typically looking for them. Right? Now, we want to make sure that we kind of open our horizon and try and see what's going on across the entire landscape, rather than just focusing on the goals of the program, right? Which is called a goal trap. So if we focus exclusively on the goals of the program, what we can do is we can actually miss the unintended consequences of the program, which if they're poor consequences, we have to find ways to fix it. If they're good consequences, we're going to want to include that in our report to say, oh, hey, by the way, look what we can also do, okay? So kind of an example of an unintended good consequence. Back in the day, we used to use a lot of salt for food preservation, and so if you want to think of it this way, a quality improvement initiative was the use of refrigeration and salt reduction. Now, we did that strictly because it improved the preservation of our food, right? We could preserve it longer, it tasted better, so on and so forth. However, an unintended consequence of this was that we saw decreased incidence of stomach cancer, right? It was a good unintended consequence, but no one developed refrigeration with this idea in mind, okay? Now, the big thing is we have to be on the lookout for these unintended consequences so we can identify them and include them within our evaluation. Now, when we perform evaluations, we specifically need indicators and we need targets. Now, indicators, or key indicators, essentially, it's a statement or a variable that's used to gauge progress towards goals or objectives, okay? So if I look at my long-term care example that I frequently use, if I'm looking at the falls per resident, right? My indicator is going to be number of falls per resident per month, okay? This is going to be how I measure the success of my program towards goals or objectives of reducing the falls of residents within the long-term care home. The target is going to be a clarification of an indicator that basically specifies the direction of my progress or quantifies my progress towards the objective or goal, right? So if I'm looking at reducing the number of falls per resident, right? I have number of falls per month as my indicator. My target might be less than 2 falls per month, All right. Now, if I'm reaching that target, my program might be considered successful. If I'm not reaching that target, I have over 3 falls per month per resident, then I know I need to change something, or I need to really look at the quality of the program. Okay. Now, those are very simple examples of indicators or targets. We must keep in mind that our indicators and targets should also follow that SMART kind of goal setting format. All right, so the evaluation matrix, this is kind of a nice to know, or I don't know, a possible available tool that can help you develop an evaluation. What you're doing is you're looking at the logic model, you're looking at the stages across it, so the implementation, the short-term and long-term goals, and you're filling in the questions that you want to ask, the indicators that are going to be associated with those questions, the targets that you're going to set, and then your data source, data collection, data analysis methodology. All right, so this just helps you put down on paper in kind of table format and helps you to organize your thoughts. It's not an essential tool, but it's a nice tool to use to organize how to piece everything together. You can look at it part by part, and then that's going to form that full picture for you. So we've talked about the foundations of evaluation. We've talked about planning the evaluation. Now we're going to go into actually designing the evaluation itself. One of the things you have to keep in mind as we go through this last section of this week's lecture, the evaluation design is going to go hand in hand with research design. Okay, so when we talk about quantitative methodology, it's going to run parallel with quantitative research methodology. Same with the qualitative methodology, it's going to run in parallel with that. So I'm not going to go too in depth with kind of that side of the methodology. I'm going to rely that you've gotten that information through other courses. If you haven't, and that's something of interest, or it's going to be something of value to you because you don't have that information, please message me, and then I can either put you onto resources so that you can get kind of a nice little overview of it, or if enough students ask for that kind of content, I'll provide an additional lecture. It won't be tested on, going over kind of like the Cole's notes of research methodology. All right. If I do get kind of an influx of recommendations for that kind of content, I'll let you know ahead of time, and then give me a week or so I can design something and put it out there for you guys. Okay. But so that's kind of the caveat as we move into the last section. For any of the details, if you have taken a research methods course, you're going to want to refresh on kind of study design types and those kind of methodologies, but we're going to focus more so on kind of the overview of evaluation design. Okay, so like I just said, there's a lot of crossover with research methodology and evaluation. The main difference between evaluation and research methodology: in research, we're looking at generating new knowledge. We're looking at answering questions on topics that we don't have the answer for. Where evaluation, we're monitoring and we're looking to improve based on knowledge that we already have. Right? We're not trying to generate any kind of novel theory or principle or discover anything. We're looking at kind of pulling back the veil, seeing what's going on with the program, and then improving it. Okay, so that being said, we do have the crossover here. We do have qualitative methodology, quantitative methodology, and then that mixed methodology, the combination of the two. These are all applicable with evaluation as well. So like I said, concepts of observational studies and cross-sectional studies, we've talked about this before in previous lectures, but we're kind of bringing it full circle here, where we're essentially just recognizing that yes, these methodologies are going to work with evaluation as well. Now, one thing we didn't touch on previously, but is very important with evaluation, is informed consent. Okay, so there is informed consent. There are specifics if you're dealing with populations that are under the age of 18, which starts to incorporate parents and so on and so forth. This is just a general overview. Please know that there is more to the informed consent process, and for that you should probably rely on that TCPS 2 training that researchers have to partake in before they can generate research. Always kind of look at the ethical guidelines to formulate your informed consent. All right. However, at the basis, informed consent is just an individual's agreement to participate in the evaluation with the full knowledge of potential benefits or risks. Okay, and so you might be asking, like, what kind of risks would be associated with an evaluation? Well, I have done evaluations that have incorporated, or I should say that worked on programs that dealt with vulnerable populations. For vulnerable populations to partake in evaluation, the risk is that it might recall traumatic experiences, and then that recall of traumatic experiences can lead to kind of mental distress. And so we need to make sure that our participants are aware of things like that before they partake in the evaluation, pardon me, because that, A, it's part of the informed consent process. B, you want the participant to know what they're in for before they participate so that you're not presented with kind of an uncomfortable surprise along the way. All right. Now, the process of informed consent, what you're going to do is you're going to start with an introduction. You're going to introduce yourself. You're going to give a general summary of the project aims. What is it that you're here to do? You're going to let the participant know what is being asked of them. You're also going to say how the findings will be used. Often you're going to tell the participant how they can find a copy of the findings once it's completed, and you're going to provide contact information so that they can follow up with questions should they have any. All right. With informed consent as well, you also have that right to withdraw piece, right? A participant is allowed to withdraw at any point during the time of the evaluation, and if they choose, and it is possible, you have to remove their data from the evaluation. Okay, it's probably the only time that you can take data away is when that participant requests that you remove their data if possible. Now, all of this also has to be in writing. It has to be on a form, right? You have to ensure that the participant reads the consent form, and then you have to witness them sign it, right? And you have to do so in a way that is not perceived as coercive, right? You can't force anyone to sign informed consent. You just strictly have to witness that they signed it, that they've read it, and that if they have any questions, that you've answered any questions associated with the evaluation. Now, when it comes to collecting data, there are several ways that we can collect data. So the main two I have here basically splits off between quantitative data collection. So we're using survey instruments, questionnaires. You might collect, depending on what it is that you're evaluating. If you're collecting kind of active data, right? So you're using like biometric data collection tools, accelerometers, things like that. That's also applicable. But you also have your qualitative piece, right? You have your interviews, your focus groups, and these can be unstructured, semi-structured, or structured. Another point that you can add here is you can have observational data collection, right? Which is you can simply look at security camera footage, right? Depending, again, what you're evaluating. If you're looking at kind of line work, you can go down on the line, you can observe how the workers interact with their environment, so on and so forth, right? There are many different ways to collect data, right? This is just kind of to get the creativity flowing so that you understand the different ways. Now, one thing we should talk about is survey instruments. Basically, this refers to questionnaires that give participant a standard set of questions across all participants, and there are response categories, all right? So it's not open-ended. On the flip side, you can have written interview tools where you provide people with open-ended, questionnaires. That is kind of a form of qualitative data collection, right? It's almost like you're replacing just the verbal component of an interview with written answer. Okay, so after you've kind of collected your data, and like I said, with the data collection tools, you really want to, if possible, you're going to want to use a tool that has already been developed, validated, and proven reliable. If not, you can develop that tool. We've talked about that in a previous lecture, so I didn't include it here, but I do want to point out that it is the same process in terms of that kind of questionnaire creation piece. I believe it was in either the last lecture or the lecture before that we talked about it. of how to create kind of that data collection tool. I didn't want to be redundant and bring it up again, but I am going to refer you back to that lecture so that you are familiar with that part, okay? Now, obviously, we have also skipped out on the data analysis piece of it. Like I said, this follows very much in parallel to the research methods, methodology process. Also, we're going to talk about that in more detail later on in the course. Again, for trying to avoid redundancy, we're not going to go into detail here. We are jumping straight to post-evaluation, but just be aware that after data collection and creation of tools, you do have to collect the data, you have to clean the data, which we've talked about, you have to analyze it, perform your statistics, generate your report, and then disseminate the report, all right? But let's say we've done all that. We've now arrived at post-evaluation, and the thing is, with evaluation, change takes time, and we've talked about that as well, right? Once you've evaluated and you're implementing kind of the changes to the program, you have to understand that there's going to be a length of time for people to come around to that change and then implement it, right? The things that are going to govern change are the emotion of the stakeholders, right? They have to be open to that change. The skill of the people that are operating within the program, right? They have to have that skill that's necessary to enact that change. I cannot take someone, if we're looking at, say, something IT driven, I can't expect everyone to flip on a dime and use different coding styles or different programs. I have to allow time for that transition of skill, and I have to be aware of the capability of these teams to accept the change, right? They have to be capable and able and have that capacity to take on that change and implement it. Also, it should be discussed that with the embedded evaluation framework, you're not trying to do massive change all at once. You're trying to do incremental change and evolve that program over time. It does not happen quickly, and we have to take it step by step through a stepwise process.
All right, and that's course content for this week done. So just a reminder, final exam information, it will be a multiple choice exam. It is cumulative. It will be available the first day of the exam week, or the exam weeks, I should say. And after the exam period, the last day of the exam period, it will close at 11:59. Same process as the midterm. I didn't see any questions about the midterm, so I assume if there's no questions, everything went as planned. Reminder, assignment 1 marks should be out this week. If you don't see your marks by the end of the week, send me an email and I'll just make sure that everything rolled out properly. And assignment 2, if you have any questions, please send them sooner rather than later. And with that one, remember April 3rd, 7:59 p.m. Now with that one, I'm going to do my best to get you those marks before the exam period starts, but that one's a little bit tighter. I will do my best to get those out as quick as possible. Again, any questions, any concerns, please reach out to me over Canvas. Have a good week.